Hello guys, and welcome to my new video, and today we're going to be talking about the best healers, or my predictions for the best healers in Season 3, and this is going to be my meta predictions. We'll talk about the raid buffs, the utility, the output, the throughput, how each healer feels, the good, the bad, and we're going to be ranking them, so let's go and get started. Now, just a little disclaimer about the ranking. I've retested every single healer on PTR because there has been some significant changes in PTR because your item level was increased, and Blizzard has made some significant changes to dungeon mobs. Blizzard decided to increase the mob HP but also reduce mob damage, so this is an indication that Blizzard might want you to reach a point where you're not timing keys because your group DPS is too low rather than the survivability. But then you look at the fact that a lot of the gear on PTR had avoidance on it, and people who were testing had an insane amount of avoidance. So now the perspective of what Season 3 will look like is a little bit muddled. Is DPS going to be the most important factor in terms of timing keys, or survivability is going to be something that is going to be a big blocker? We'll talk about this further in the summary of the video, and we'll talk about each healer. And again, if you like these videos, like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, so let's go and get started. And as you can see, I decided to change the tier list a little bit, so now we have S+, we have S, A, and B, because I do think that the balance between a lot of the healers might actually be pretty close. But we're gonna start off with the first healer in terms of the S+ tier, and I don't think this is going to be any surprise to anyone because my previous ranking is very similar to this, and we're going to talk about Wildstalker Resto Druid. We're going to be placing it in that S tier or S+ tier because of the output that Wildstalker can produce. In terms of pure healing or healing checks, there is no better healer than Wildstalker Resto Druid, especially for what type of fights. Honestly, it makes these fights feel like a joke compared to some other healers. I've been testing a lot of Floodgate because Floodgate is just such a fantastic dungeon to test all the strengths and weaknesses of each healer. There hasn't been a lot of changes since my last video for Resto Druid. Wildstalker is still performing really well. It's doing cooldown levels of healing without actually pressing cooldowns. It is a healer that requires setup. It is a healer that has a high skill ceiling, so if you know how to play Restoration Druid, you're going to get rewarded in Season 3. Now, the big if, or the big elephant in the room right now, Resto Druid or Wildstalker Resto Druid is bugged because talents like Rampart Growth interact with your tier set in such a way that it produces a lot more symbiotic blooms than, let's say, it should. So right now, you look at symbiotic blooms, you look at the rest of the interaction with the Druid class in terms of talents like Vigorous Creepers, you're looking at a possible bug that could be very impactful if it gets fixed. But the thing is, there's a lot of bugs in World of Warcraft that never get addressed or never get fixed, and we're not sure what's going to happen. Right now, I wanted to do a little bit experimentation, so I did a couple of dungeons as a Wildstalker Resto Druid without Rampart Growth talent, which meant that I avoided the bug, but I also was not able to make use of the normal Rampart Growth interaction, so I was playing Resto Druid in a super nerfed version. I wanted to see what Resto Druid will feel like if the bug was fixed. But I can tell you right now, Wildstalker Resto Druid would not be dead. I still think you will be able to do a good amount of healing, but if they fix this bug, it'll be extremely noticeable, and I think Resto Druid would fall from that S+ tier if Blizzard decides to do anything about it. But honestly, there's a lot of speculation because we're not sure what's going to happen. Maybe Blizzard is not going to fix the bug. Maybe Blizzard is going to fix the bug and give you compensation buffs to kind of make it easier for you. We're not sure. All I know as of right now, Resto Druid is an absolute beast when it comes to Mythic Plus in Season 3. And especially considering the fact that Restoration Druid or Druid's Mark of the Wild, if you look at other specs that could provide that in terms of Balanced Druid, it's not doing all that well in Mythic Plus content. Feral Druid kind of requires physical comp to really get the full use out of that spec. And also Guardian Druid is not looking too meta as I'm making this video. Remember, the source of Mark of the Wild can change at any given point depending on tuning, and that can be meta defining. I actually think the fact that Resto Druid is providing so much healing on top of one of the best raid buffs in terms of Mark of the Wild puts Resto Druid in that S+ tier. So Wildstalker is looking really good, but keep your ear to the ground for any possible Restoration Druid bug fixes because they could be extremely impactful for this tier list. So now let's talk about our second healer, and that is going to be Discipline Priest. I'm going to be placing Discipline Priest in that S tier section right now, and I've retested Oracle after the item level increases, after some of the dungeon changes, and honestly, I was pleasantly surprised in terms of how Oracle Discipline Priest felt based on my previous testing. And I don't know if it's because Oracle Discipline Priest has insane item level scaling or something along those lines, but honestly, retesting Oracle again felt quite good. I know that the shielding component of Oracle Discipline Priest has been nerfed, and you can still feel that. I still feel like having shields is better than not having shields. And having access to things like double pain suppression, having fortitude in terms of raid buffs, having things like PI, they're always going to be utilized in proper, consistent groups when it comes to that Mythic Plus content. So I am not writing off Oracle Discipline Priest. I think with some help, Oracle could actually still become a very potent Mythic Plus healer. Now, you also have access to Void Weaver, which I also think you could use depending on certain dungeons, depending on what you need. Now, Void Weaver has different advantages and disadvantages. Void Weaver damage is a lot higher than Oracle. Void Weaver AoE healing when you have your pet, when you have your rift, it feels really, really nice. But then, your healing outside of those cooldowns, and also your single target healing is somewhat questionable. So you might make decisions depending on which dungeon you want to do, but I'm not writing off Discipline Priest. I actually was pleasantly surprised in terms of my retesting of Priest. Like again, I mentioned, I retested Priest the second that you had the nerfs come in. I retested the Priest after you had item level increases, after you had certain changes to the dungeons. And like I said, I am relatively surprised about how powerful this healer is still to this day, even after some of the nerfs. Now, I did have some mana issues as an Oracle Discipline Priest, but honestly, I don't think that's going to be a deal breaker. And if you're a good Discipline Priest or Oracle Discipline Priest that can make use of the full toolkit, and believe me, you have a full toolkit that you can use depending on situations. We talked about double pain suppressions and all those things. If you can utilize all those things, you can have a good time as an Oracle Discipline Priest. You can play around with Void Weaver. We also have to talk about the survivability and the power of shields. Now, it's really hard to judge what Season 3 Mythic Plus dungeons are going to be like, because on PTR they buffed the mob HP, but they also nerfed mob damage. But also, for whatever reason, on PTR, everyone had an insane amount of avoidance. So when we're actually doing live servers and we don't have that crazy number of avoidance, we'll have to see how the shields and the power of absorbs is going to feel like. And now let's talk about the next healer in this list, and that is going to be a Restoration Shaman. And I've been testing a lot of Resto Shaman recently, Farseer and Totemic, and honestly, I can tell you right now that it's probably looking like Season 3 is going to be the Farseer season. Don't get me wrong, I actually think you'll be able to play both of the hero builds depending on which key levels you're doing, depending on your group. Especially, for example, if you're playing Totemic Resto Shaman, having a stacked up group because of your Surging Totem, because of Downpour, because of how your tier set works, is going to be advisable. Now, I actually believe that Farseer will probably be a build that people are going to be recommending for high-end Mythic Plus pushing, because Farseer's tier set I think it's very nice. I think the fact that there's less emphasis on healing rain, because in Season 2 you had a tier set that focused on healing rain. In Season 3 it doesn't really focus on healing rain, and I can tell you right now that there's probably going to be certain people that might even drop healing rain altogether. We'll have to see. Farseer Resto Shaman with the new nice beautiful Season 3 tier set, I think the DPS potential of Farseer Resto Shaman is really good, but you do have to focus on DPS instead of healing to do it, because a lot of the Farseer Resto Shamans will be running something like Cloudburst Totem, and for your Cloudburst Totem to do anything, you need to heal. For your ancestors to do anything, you need to press a DPS or a healing ability. So the way that you deal damage as a Farseer just depends completely on, can I focus on DPS instead of healing at this given moment? Now you have to look at some of the utility items the Resto Shaman provides. Resto Shaman, in my eyes, is the Pug King, because you have an insane interrupt, you have knock up, knockback, depending on how you talent into that, you have a AoE stone, you have Purge. Decurse doesn't have as much value as I anticipated, because there's been a lot of changes in, for example, in Halls of Atonement, there is no longer a Decurse there, but you also have ways of increasing players' HP through talents like Ancestral Vigor, which is great. If you're playing Totemic, you will be playing Downpour, which is also another way of increasing players' HP. If you're playing Farseer, I'm not sure if Downpour is going to be extremely popular, so again, there's a lot of different build variations that are kind of emerging, so you'll have less ways of increasing players' HP. But it's not a deal breaker. I think Resto Shaman is looking to be extremely nice in Season 3. I think Sky Fury in terms of Shaman buff is very, very nice, and a lot of groups are going to try and squeeze it in. I think Shaman is a prime candidate for those physical comps. Again, Shaman was very strong when it comes to physical comps in Season 2, and I think the same thing is going to continue in Season 3. So there's a lot of good things about Resto Shaman. We talked about utility, you have Bloodlust, talked about physical comps and how Resto Shaman can squeeze in there. We talked about Farseer versus Totemic. I think this is looking like a Farseer season. If you enjoy Totemic, you can absolutely make it work, but honestly, if you're looking to push the highest content in the world, or if you're bored of Totemic, please try out Farseer. It is infinitely better in Season 3 than Season 2, and that is mainly because of the fact that you are getting a much nicer tier set. Now let's talk about the next healer on this list, and this healer has grown on me over the period of PTR for multiple different reasons, and that is going to be Holy Paladin. Now, Holy Paladin at start of PTR had a lot of issues, there was a lot of bugs, there was very unequal distribution of Infusion of Light procs depending on whether you're playing Herald of the Sun or depending on whether you're playing Lightsmith. So one of the big changes that happened in Season 3 is Infusion of Light and the way that you proc it, and also some of the power of the abilities that are affected by Infusion of Light. So I was spending most of my time testing Lightsmith because you had talents like Laying Down Arms, which meant you were getting a lot of infusions and you ran a build that kind of empowered your Flash of Light. So it just felt like a very decent hero build to play, and I had a very good time or decent time with Lightsmith. But in a very Blizzard-like fashion, they introduced some of the significant buffs to Herald of the Sun in the last week of PTR testing. And these buffs honestly felt really significant because they were buffs to your spot healing, buffs to Eternal Flame. Eternal Flame actually really packs a punch right now. And not only buffs to Herald of the Sun, but also the proc chance of your infusions. Because if you look at Second Sunrise, in terms of how it was reworked, you're getting way more Holy Shocks, and the more Holy Shocks you have, the higher chance you have proccing Infusion of Light. After these changes, I think Herald might actually be the way to go when it comes to that Mythic Plus content. I had a very good time with Herald, honestly. Again, we talked about the power of your spenders in terms of Eternal Flame, it packs a punch. I just had a very surprising time with Holy Paladin because, like I said, at the start of PTR, they felt a lot weaker. I don't think it's the most meta healer out there, but I think if you're someone who's looking to play Holy Paladin, I think you're going to be way happier about the current state of Holy Paladin because, again, we talked about the start of PTR. So overall, I think Holy Paladin or Herald of the Sun Holy Paladin might be the way to go when it comes to that Mythic Plus content. But we'll have to see if there's going to be any further tuning because I do think there's some low-hanging fruit, especially with Lightsmith 4-set bonus, which I think should have been addressed a long time ago. But right now, I think Herald is looking pretty nice, and if you enjoy Holy Paladin, I think you're going to like Holy Paladin Season 3. And now let's talk about our next healer on this list, and honestly, I couldn't decide in terms of what is the next healer, in terms of Evoker or Mistweaver Monk, so I'm just going to be placing Chrono Ward and Evoker here, but just so you know, they're somewhat interchangeable. Now, in terms of Evoker, there's been quite a few nice changes happening in Season 3, but I also know there's a lot of players who are scared about trying Evoker because it is one of the more difficult healers to play in World of Warcraft. The fact that you can pick up double time dilation as a Evoker is nice. Your temporal anomaly shielding has been buffed significantly. It adds this kind of like a buffer to your group. Your tier set in terms of activating Tip the Scales and then pressing Chrono Flames, and they're shooting out multiple Chrono Flames. Visually, it's really pleasing. The amount of damage, the biggest thing that sticks out when playing Evoker or Chrono Ward and Evoker is your DPS is very, very high. But in the grand scheme of things, in terms of the overall DPS of the group, healer damage it's still lacking. So that's something to consider. And then you have to look at things like in terms of Evoker, raid buff is really lackluster. I don't think there's going to be a lot of groups who are going to be like, hey, we really need Evoker for that Blessing of the Bronze right now. I actually would like Evoker raid buff to be changed or reworked in the future, because right now it's not something that it can compete with some of the other healer raid buffs. And in terms of the gameplay for Evoker, a lot of people, like I mentioned already, are going to find it difficult to utilize every single aspect. There's quite a few different builds coming around or messing around. There is going to be changes in your spec tree in terms of what is going to be the best build, because trying to squeeze in double TDs, trying to squeeze in some of the quality of life talents. So I do think Evoker can do good numbers, especially when it comes to DPS. But the sad truth that I think the trend is going to continue. There's going to be a lot of players asking themselves, why should I swap over to Chrono Ward and Evoker and have to try a lot harder than some other healers out there in this list for somewhat similar results? A lot of players will be like, why should I not swap to something like Resto Shaman, have an easier time and arguably provide more utility, and just call it a day. Having said that, I actually do think a lot of people tend to undervalue Preservation Evoker. A good Evoker can actually pump numbers. I just feel like Preservation Evoker needs to be busted OP in order to be considered meta. But if you're someone who enjoys Evoker playstyle, you should stick with them. I think it is a fun healer, and I think the fact that it is a healer with really high skill ceiling, there's always ways to get better and there's always ways to improve. And now let's talk about the next healer on this list, and that's going to be Mistweaver Monk. Now, I could place Mistweaver Monk above Evoker, or I could place it here. Honestly, I think it's extremely interchangeable. It's something that I haven't really decided. I'm going to be placing Mistweaver Monk here. I'll talk about it in the summary of the video, but I've tested multiple of the hero builds in terms of Master of Harmony, in terms of Conduit of the Celestial. So it's looking like Master of Harmony might be the go-to spec for Mistweaver Monk when it comes to that Mythic Plus content, and it's going to be Conduit of the Celestial when it comes to that raiding content. It's something very similar that you had in Season 2. Now, in terms of the tier set for Master of Harmony, I think it is somewhat simplistic, but it's also kind of fun to play around. So I had a decent time with Mistweaver Monk when it comes to that Mythic Plus content. There has been some changes in terms of how your Vivacious Vivification works. There has also been buffs to your cooldowns like Revival when it comes to 5-man content, but that is not specific to Mistweaver Monk. A lot of the other healer cooldowns has also been buffed specifically in that 5-man content. You also had Chi Harmony, or the power of Chi Harmony, being reduced and more power being placed into your Vivifies. And we also have to look at raid buffs. Now, as a monk, you provide Mystic Touch, and I think that is going to be something that people will want in those physical comps. There is going to be a physical comp, in my opinion, coming into Season 3, and people are looking at utilizing every single significant physical buff in that group. And people will want to have Mystic Touch. Now, unfortunately for Mistweaver Monk, Brewmaster Monk looks like a very solid option for those specific comps. So honestly, it's looking like Mystic Touch might be provided by someone other than a Mistweaver Monk. But honestly, that does not mean you can't make your own groups, push Mythic Plus content as a Mistweaver Monk, and have a good time, especially if you like that melee gameplay. Now, there might be other builds emerging for Mistweaver Monk that you can do depending on the key level you're doing, but honestly, this is a tier list based on meta, based on utilizing every single aspect, based on looking at raid buffs, throughput, and all those things. And this is why I'm placing Mistweaver in that A tier. And I actually don't think it's a coincidence that the last 3 specs in this tier list, in terms of Preservation, Evoker, Mistweaver Monk, and Holy Priest, that those specs feel significantly better in raid content than they do in Mythic Plus. And now in terms of the last healer, and I don't think it's going to be a big surprise, but I'm going to be placing Holy Priest, or specifically Oracle Holy Priest, in that B tier. Now, I did try out Archon, I did try out Oracle, and I found Oracle to be better option when it comes to that Mythic Plus content. And honestly, Oracle is also a better option when it comes to raiding content as well, or based on some of the logs that I've seen. So Oracle seems to be the dominant part of Holy Priest at this given moment. And I do think that Oracle Holy Priest tier set is actually really fun. You get to send out more Prayer of Mendings because your Premonition of Insights, you're getting more of those, and Prayer of Mending has a heal attached to it, and it feels like you're sending out additional spot healing when you have it available. It feels relatively fun to play around. I did try out multiple different builds. You can run Holy Priest with Prayer of Healing, you can run Holy Priest without Prayer of Healing, and I'm honestly not sure what the best build is going to be. And I can tell you right now, there is a significant difference in power in terms of playing Holy Priest when it comes to that Mythic Plus content versus playing in raids. Or maybe Blizzard is just not sure how to balance Holy Priest in Mythic Plus versus raid, because right now, when you're playing Holy Priest in Mythic Plus content, I can tell you right now, it needs to have some sort of buff when it comes to smaller content. It does not need a buff when it comes to raiding content, and I think Blizzard needed to address that weeks ago, but right now, the patch has launched, there hasn't been any significant changes, and I think Holy Priest is going to stay in that a bit lower tier when compared to some of the other healers out there. That does not mean you can't push keys. Good Holy Priests are going to make this spec work, but unfortunately, I think there is a severe lack of love towards Holy Priest in that Mythic Plus. I know it sounds kind of simple, but if there was a way to apply an aura buff specifically for Holy Priest in that Mythic Plus content, I think they could really use that. And I know there's going to be a lot of Holy Priests who are going to be really upset about this fact because of the comparison between Holy Priest and Discipline Priest. If you're pushing high-end Mythic Plus content, people might be like, why aren't you playing Discipline? And I always hated that comparison because you should play the healer that you enjoy the most. And you have to remember, this video is looking at top-end Mythic Plus content. It's trying to predict some of the meta or meta classes and things like that. Holy Priest is more than fine until you get to a certain key level, and who knows, maybe Blizzard will address some of the issues. Now let's look at a summary of the video and some of the harsh truths. Now this is my tier list based on meta, based on raid buffs, based on throughput, based on how each healer can slot in some of these meta 5-man comps. Now keep in mind, anything can change because there is going to be further tuning. But this is why I think that if you know how to play Evoker, you can make it work. If you know how to play Mistweaver, you can make it work. If you know how to play Holy Priest, you can make it work depending on your time investment and depending on the keys that you're doing. But the harsh reality is that there is a snowball effect. There's always a snowball effect, and I think these 3 healers that are placed in that S, and this is why I placed it in S plus and S tier. These healers in that S are going to run away with it if nothing changes. The snowball effect is going to come into effect, and then you'll probably see something like 80% of the highest keys in Mythic Plus being done by a combination of these 3 healers specifically. We talked about Resto Druid in terms of Wildstalker, in terms of the throughput, in terms of the fact that Mark of the Wild from Resto Druid is looking like a very solid option. Resto Druid right now, if nothing changes, is looking really strong in terms of throughput, in terms of Mark of the Wild, and there is a big if. We talked about the rampart growth bug. We'll have to see if that's going to be fixed or not. And I kind of mentioned, if that bug is fixed without any compensation, Resto Druid will fall. So that's something that you need to be fully aware of. And we talked about Oracle Discipline Priest, and honestly my retesting of Oracle Discipline Priest felt better than expected with the increased item level that I had on PTR. And there is a debate about the value of shields, because you have to look at the fact that Blizzard increased mobs HP, but they also reduce mobs damage. But you have to remember, on PTR everyone had an insane amount of avoidance. When you're going to be doing live keys, you're not going to have that avoidance, so we'll have to see at the value that shields can provide to the party. And honestly, with some luck, Oracle Discipline Priest could actually become a meta healer again, and you also have an option Void Weaver depending on situation, so do not write off Discipline Priest just yet. And we'll talk about Resto Shaman. We talked about Fireseer probably being the better option when it comes to high-end Mythic content. Again, I still think you can run Totemic and still have a good time, and Resto Shaman in terms of Skyfury, in terms of utility, Bloodlust, all those things, it can slot into that physical comp or melee comp really nicely. And people are already talking about the possibility of meta comps and Resto Shaman slotting in there, so that's something to consider. Honestly, all the rest of the other healers in this list, their throughput or their damage in some cases might be better than some of the healers here, but they might be lacking some of the raid buffs, or they're just missing something to slot them into that 5-man comp as it is looking right now as I'm making this video. That does not mean these healers are unplayable. And a lot of the times, there's going to be healers that can provide more damage or more healing, and they might not be meta, which we saw that in Season 2, specifically for Resto Druid, because you can look at the fact that Resto Druid was doing good healing in Season 2, but he was not meta. And you could absolutely make the rest of the healers work, but I know what the community is like. The snowball effect is extremely aggressive. If you're not the best healer, you're the worst healer. But I just want you to remember that playing the healer that you enjoy the most is the best value for your subscription. If you're re-rolling to a healer that you don't enjoy, you're not going to stick with that healer for a long time. And honestly, a lot of the times the difference between some of the healers is not even that big. This is trying to nitpick every single aspect. And honestly, if Blizzard removed a lot of the raid buffs that healers have in that specific Mythicus content, this list would look very different. So guys, let me know how you feel about this video. Let me know which healer you're maining in Season 3. And I hope you enjoyed this video, so please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next guide.